It was legal, prescribed, and killing more people than heroin. Nobody noticed. In the winter of 2016, the chief pathologist for Northern Ireland published a report that stopped several of her colleagues mid-sentence when they read it. The numbers were not wrong. They had checked them 3 times. Pregabalin, a small white capsule prescribed for nerve pain, for epilepsy, for the kind of chronic ache that doesn't let people sleep, had appeared in the toxicology results of more overdose deaths in Northern Ireland that year than heroin. Not alongside heroin, more than heroin. The report sat on desks. It was shared through internal email chains. It was read by people who had spent their careers tracking the opioid crisis. People who thought they understood what the most dangerous drug in a community looked like, and every single one of them had the same reaction. They went back and checked the data again. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The drug had a brand name, Lyrica. It was manufactured by Pfizer, one of the most recognizable pharmaceutical companies on Earth. It was not sold in back alleys. It was not smuggled in shipping containers. It was written on prescription pads by family doctors, dispensed by pharmacists in white paper bags and covered by national health insurance in dozens of countries. The capsules came in pastel colours: white, orange, purple, depending on the dose. They looked like vitamins. In 2004, the year the United States Food and Drug Administration approved Pregabalin for the first time, British pharmacies filled roughly 500,000 prescriptions for it. A substantial number, but not alarming. The drug was new, the conditions it treated were real, and the medical community had reason to be cautiously optimistic. By 2018, that number had reached 8.1 million annual prescriptions in the UK alone. That is not a gradual increase. That is not normal adoption of a useful medication. A 1,500% rise in 14 years is something else entirely, and it happened so quietly that most people living through it never noticed. Globally, the picture is larger still. By the early 2020s, Pregabalin and its chemical predecessor gabapentin, together called gabapentinoids, were being prescribed at a rate of over 90 million scripts per year worldwide. In some regions of England, Pregabalin was being prescribed more frequently than antidepressants. In parts of Wales, the prescription rate was triple the national average, concentrated in communities already devastated by unemployment and existing drug crises. In Scotland, researchers found Pregabalin present in nearly half of all drug-related deaths they examined, not as the only substance, but as the one that had tipped survivable situations into fatal ones. The drug did not behave the way its label said it would. That is the core of this story. Not the chemistry, not the regulatory process, not the abstract machinery of pharmaceutical approval. The gap between what the label said and what the drug did, and everything that fell into that gap: careers, families, lives, and an unknowable number of deaths that were recorded under other headings. In prisons across England and Wales, Pregabalin became the dominant traded commodity by the mid-2000s, surpassing tobacco, which had been the prison economy's currency for decades. A single capsule of 300 milligrams, a dose that many patients were prescribed daily, sometimes twice daily, sold for £5 inside. Inmates found ways to carry them through security in quantities that baffled corrections officers, because the drug wasn't classified as controlled, which meant the legal framework for intercepting it was weak, and the penalties for possession were minimal. Outside the prisons, the street market operated on different logic. Pregabalin was available online through pharmacies that required nothing more than a self-reported symptom checklist. It was cheap. A month's supply could be obtained for less than the cost of a meal, and because it wasn't scheduled as a controlled substance in most countries until years after the crisis had already fully developed, carrying it, buying it, or selling it occupied a strange legal grey zone that neither law enforcement nor public health systems were equipped to address. Here is what nobody told the people taking it. Pregabalin works on the brain in ways that are not fully dissimilar to alcohol or to benzodiazepines. The class of drugs that includes Valium and Xanax, drugs that carry explicit addiction warnings and are prescribed with significant caution. It calms the central nervous system. It reduces the firing of overexcited neurons. In the right doses, for the right patients, this is genuinely useful. The pain quiets, the seizures slow, the anxiety lifts, the relief is real, and then the body adjusts. The body, when given a substance that artificially quiets its nervous system, begins to compensate. It increases its own excitatory activity to maintain balance, which means that when the drug is removed, even briefly, the nervous system swings violently in the opposite direction, shaking, burning skin, insomnia so complete it feels physical, seizures, in severe cases psychosis. These are not side effects of taking Pregabalin. These are the consequences of stopping it. Patients reported these symptoms to their doctors. Doctors, working from official literature that classified Pregabalin as having low abuse potential, told their patients the symptoms were their original conditions returning. Fibromyalgia coming back, nerve pain flaring up, anxiety reasserting itself. The drug, in other words, disguised its own withdrawal as the illness it was treating. This went on for years. The people who first noticed that something was wrong were not regulators or pharmaceutical executives. They were harm reduction workers in Dublin, sitting across from people who had never seen a prescription in their lives, but who were showing up in withdrawal from a drug they'd been buying on the street. They were prison nurses in Liverpool noticing that inmates coming off Pregabalin cold turkey were seizing on the floor. They were coroners in Belfast staring at toxicology reports, then staring at them again. The question none of them could immediately answer was not what the drug was doing. That part was becoming clear. The question was how a substance capable of creating this kind of physical dependency had spent years on the market with a label that said it was unlikely to be misused. How the trials that produced that label had been designed, who had designed them, what they had and hadn't measured, and, underneath all of that, what the company that held the patent had known, and when they had known it. That is the question this story will answer. But first, a laboratory, 1990. A chemist who was trying, in complete good faith, to make something that would help people who are suffering. Because this story, like most stories about drugs that go wrong, did not begin with malice. It began with hope. Richard Silverman was not trying to get rich. That is worth saying plainly, because the story of Pregabalin will eventually involve a company that made $21 billion from his work, and it matters that the man who started it was motivated by something else entirely. In 1988, Silverman was a professor of chemistry at Northwestern University in Illinois, working in a field that most people outside of neuroscience had never heard of, the biochemistry of epilepsy. The condition, at the time, was managed by drugs that worked, but worked crudely, like trying to fix a watch by hitting it with a hammer. Phenytoin, valproate, carbamazepine. These were the tools available, and they suppressed seizures by suppressing enormous swaths of brain activity simultaneously. Patients stopped seizing. They also became foggy, slow, and in some cases cognitively damaged by the treatment itself. The drugs were not elegant, they were simply better than the alternative. Silverman believed there was a more precise solution. The brain communicates through chemical signals, and one of the most important of those signals is a molecule called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which functions as the nervous system's natural brake. When neurons fire too rapidly, GABA slows them down. In epilepsy, that braking system is impaired, and neurons fire in uncontrolled cascades that roll through the brain like a storm. Silverman's theory was that if he could find a molecule that enhanced the brain's own braking chemistry, rather than simply suppressing everything, the result would be a treatment with fewer side effects and more precision. He was working specifically on compounds that could cross from the bloodstream into the brain, a barrier that most molecules cannot pass. The blood-brain barrier is the brain's bouncer, highly selective, ruthlessly effective, and the reason why most drugs that work on paper fail in the body. Silverman's compounds needed to get through. They also needed to mimic GABA closely enough to interact with the right receptors without triggering cascades of unintended effects elsewhere. The compound that eventually became Pregabalin was synthesized around 1990. Its internal designation was C-1008. Structurally, it was a modified version of GABA, close enough to the natural molecule to pass the blood-brain barrier, but different enough to be absorbed efficiently. In early laboratory tests, it reduced seizure activity in animal models more effectively than anything Silverman had produced before. The data was clean. The toxicity profile was, by the standards of the era, unremarkable. He did not find any obvious warning signs. He was not looking in the wrong places. The tools available to him simply did not measure what would eventually matter most. Meanwhile, a different compound, one of Silverman's earlier creations, gabapentin, which he had developed in the 1970s, had already been licensed to a company called Parke-Davis and approved by the FDA in 1993 for epilepsy and later for nerve pain. Gabapentin worked, but its absorption by the body was inconsistent and dose-dependent, meaning patients needed multiple pills a day, and their blood levels fluctuated unpredictably. Pfizer, which had acquired Parke-Davis, was watching gabapentin's commercial trajectory with considerable interest, and what they saw was not a ceiling. It was a floor. When Pfizer's licensing team encountered Silverman's new compound, C1008, the appeal was immediate. Pregabalin absorbed more reliably than gabapentin, reached higher concentrations in the brain, and appeared to work at lower doses. Pfizer signed a licensing agreement with Northwestern University in 2000. The compound left the academic world and entered the pharmaceutical development pipeline. The clinical trials that followed enrolled thousands of patients across multiple countries. The primary outcomes, reduction in seizure frequency, reduction in pain scores for diabetic neuropathy, were positive. The drug worked for what it was designed to do. The trials also measured safety, liver function, kidney function, cardiovascular effects, standard parameters. The results were acceptable across the board. What the trials did not do was enroll patients with a history of substance use disorder. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate exclusion criterion, standard practice in pharmaceutical trials, used to reduce variability in the data and protect vulnerable populations from experimental drugs. The logic was defensible. The consequence was that the drug's behavior in people with addictive tendencies was never measured. The label that resulted from those trials, the label that said Pregabalin had low abuse potential, was accurate for the population studied. The population studied was not the population that would take the drug. The FDA approved Pregabalin in December 2004. In Europe, the European Medicines Agency approved it in 2004 as well. The approvals covered epilepsy and diabetic peripheral neuropathy, nerve pain caused by diabetes, a condition affecting tens of millions of people worldwide. The drug was placed in Schedule 5 in the United States, the lowest controlled substance category, typically reserved for preparations with minimal abuse potential. In the United Kingdom, it was not scheduled as a controlled substance at all. Silverman at Northwestern received royalties. He has spoken since about his reaction to the way the drug story unfolded, not through any statement of regret, but through the specific, careful way a scientist discusses outcomes that diverged from predictions. He described, in a 2019 interview with a chemistry journal, how he had never anticipated the drug being used outside the parameters of the original trials. The parameters, he noted, had seemed sufficient at the time. They had seemed sufficient. In Pfizer's offices in New York, the approval of Lyrica, the brand name chosen for Pregabalin, was cause for measurable optimism. The drug had a clean profile, it had a large potential market, and it had something gabapentin had lacked, a more compelling commercial story. Lyrica was not just an epilepsy drug. Within a year of its initial approval, Pfizer was already in discussions with the FDA about an additional indication, fibromyalgia, a condition affecting an estimated 4 million Americans, predominantly women, characterized by widespread chronic pain, fatigue, and the particular cruelty of being largely invisible on medical tests. No marker in the blood, no lesion on the scan, just pain, constant and unverifiable, that had left an entire patient population cycling through medical dismissals for decades. In 2007, the FDA approved Pregabalin as the first drug ever specifically licensed to treat fibromyalgia. The significance of that designation cannot be overstated. It meant Pfizer could market Lyrica directly to fibromyalgia patients, and there were millions of them, many of them desperate, many of them having spent years being told their pain was psychological. The drug gave them something they had never had before, a prescription with their specific diagnosis on the box. In the spring of 2005, a year before the fibromyalgia approval, but in the weeks immediately following the first round of prescription data coming in, a Pfizer sales projection document, later entered into court records, described Lyrica's commercial ceiling as essentially undefined. Undefined. In a document written by people who already knew about the $430 million they had just agreed to pay the Department of Justice. That payment, that settlement, for illegal off-label marketing of gabapentin, the drug that preceded Pregabalin, had been finalized in 2004, the same year Lyrica was approved. The same company, the same drug class, a federal settlement for promoting a drug for uses it hadn't been approved for, reaching patients it wasn't studied in, through marketing that the government deemed fraudulent. No executive faced criminal charges. Pfizer paid the fine, and on the other side of that fine, already in production, already approved, already sitting on the desks of sales representatives preparing to call on doctors across the country, was Lyrica. The bottle was open. The question was what would pour out of it. The fibromyalgia approval landed in January 2007, and within 6 weeks Pfizer's television advertising campaign for Lyrica was running in prime time across the United States. The ads showed women, always women, because the condition skewed heavily female, moving through their days with visible ease, carrying groceries, playing with grandchildren, tending gardens. The voiceover described fibromyalgia as a real condition, a medical condition, one that now had a real treatment. For millions of patients who had spent years being told their pain was stress, or depression, or simply in their heads, the advertisement was not a commercial. It was a vindication. Prescriptions accelerated immediately. In the United Kingdom, the timeline was slightly different. Direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising was illegal, but the effect on prescription rates was comparable, driven instead by clinical guidelines and GP education materials that positioned Pregabalin as a first-line option for multiple pain conditions. British family doctors were writing Lyrica prescriptions for diabetic nerve pain, for post-surgical pain, for generalized anxiety disorder, an indication approved in Europe but not in the United States. and increasingly for the broad category of chronic pain that didn't fit neatly anywhere else. It was in this moment, the spring of 2005, that Sarah Connolly first walked into a consultation room in Leeds and described what her body had been doing for the previous 3 years. She was 34 years old. She taught Year 6, 10 and 11-year-olds at a primary school in the Headingley area of Leeds, and she had been managing a specific, unrelenting kind of pain since 2002. A widespread ache concentrated in her shoulders, her hips, and the soles of her feet, accompanied by a fatigue so heavy that she sometimes sat in her car in the school car park for 20 minutes after the bell rang before she could make herself drive home. 2 previous GPs had suggested she was overworked. One had prescribed antidepressants, which hadn't touched the pain. A rheumatologist had run blood work, found nothing actionable, and discharged her. Her new GP listened for longer than the previous ones. He'd attended a clinical update conference 3 months earlier, where Pregabalin had been discussed in the context of fibromyalgia and central sensitization. The theory that in some patients, the nervous system itself becomes hypersensitized, amplifying pain signals that should be routine. He wrote the prescription on a Tuesday morning. Lyrica, 75 milligrams twice daily. He told her the drug was new, well tolerated, and specifically designed for the kind of pain she was describing. She filled it at the pharmacy on her lunch break. By Thursday evening, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not a switch flipping, but the constant background noise of pain had dropped a register, the way a refrigerator hum disappears and you only notice the silence after. She slept through the night for the first time in months. On Friday, she stood in front of her class and taught a full lesson on the water cycle without needing to sit down once. Sarah did not know, in that moment, that what she was experiencing was pharmacologically similar to what someone drinks toward with their 3rd glass of wine. The mechanism was different in its specifics but convergent in its effect, a quieting of the nervous system, a lowering of the threshold at which the brain registered discomfort, a warmth at the edges of things that she interpreted reasonably as the absence of suffering. The drug worked. That was undeniable. What was also happening, invisible and automatic, was the beginning of her brain's compensation. 3,000 kilometres to the west, in a housing estate on the northern edge of Belfast, a 23-year-old named Declan Farrell was not thinking about neuroscience. He was thinking about the weekend. He worked 5 days a week at a logistics depot near the docks, loading and unloading, and on Friday evenings he coached the under-12s at his local football club, a routine he'd maintained since he was 19, having played youth football himself until a knee injury ended any serious ambitions. He drank on weekends. He smoked occasionally. He had no meaningful history with drugs beyond cannabis at parties in his late teens. The first Pregabalin he ever took was handed to him by a friend in February 2006. Not sold, handed, the way someone passes a paracetamol across a table. The friend had a prescription for back pain and described the pills as something that took the edge off. Declan was having a difficult few weeks, a conflict at work, his mother's health declining, and he swallowed the capsule without much consideration. Within an hour, the tightness across his shoulders had dissolved. He felt, as he would later describe it to a caseworker, looser, as if the volume on everything had been turned down slightly. He asked for 2 more before he left his friend's flat that night. He took them home in his jacket pocket. This was the feature of Pregabalin's early street spread that no data system was designed to capture. It moved through social networks in exactly the way that legitimate medications move through households. Shared between friends, offered without transaction, described with a vocabulary of relief, not intoxication. Nobody told Declan he was taking a drug with addiction potential, because nobody who handed it to him knew. The friend who gave it to him had been prescribed it by a doctor. The doctor had prescribed it in good faith. The information gap ran in both directions. By the middle of 2006, harm reduction workers in Dublin were beginning to document something that didn't fit their existing frameworks. People were presenting at needle exchanges and drop-in centres describing dependency on a substance that wasn't on any controlled list, wasn't captured in any drug survey, and didn't produce the visible markers, track marks, weight loss, the particular hollowing of opioid addiction that caseworkers had been trained to identify. The drug was Pregabalin. The people describing it weren't typical pharmaceutical patients. They were people whose relationship with the healthcare system was complicated, for whom a GP prescription was not the primary route of access to anything. The supply chain operating below the official one was already mature and functional. Online pharmacies, operating legally under the regulatory frameworks of countries that required minimal verification, were shipping Pregabalin across Europe at prices that undercut street markets for almost every comparable substance. A month's supply of 300 milligram capsules could be obtained for €20. No prescription in practice was required. The websites asked users to confirm they had consulted a doctor. Most users clicked yes and entered their card details. In police custody suites across Northern Ireland, officers began noting Pregabalin on the property sheets of people arrested for unrelated offences: shoplifting, minor assault, driving offences. The drug appeared again and again, in quantities that exceeded any individual's prescription needs, in the pockets and bags of people who had no prescription at all. The officers recorded it. They had no legal framework for doing anything else. Pregabalin was not a controlled substance. Possession was not an offence. The data was accumulating. Nobody had yet built the system to read it. Sarah Connolly, meanwhile, had returned to her GP in October 2005, 7 months after her initial prescription, and asked about increasing her dose. The 75 milligrams twice daily had continued to manage her pain, but the effect had become less consistent over recent weeks, particularly by late afternoon when the morning dose had worn thin. Her GP increased her to 150 milligrams twice daily. Standard clinical practice. The dose was well within the licensed range, and her pain scores on the questionnaire she completed in the waiting room had improved substantially compared to her baseline. She left the surgery with a new prescription and a follow-up appointment booked for 6 months later. On the drive home, she stopped at a junction and noticed, for the first time, that the thought of the appointment being 6 months away rather than 3 had produced something that felt almost like anxiety. She didn't know what to do with that feeling, so she drove home, and in an online forum for fibromyalgia patients, a message board with about 4,000 registered users, most of them women in their 30s and 40s, a thread appeared that month titled simply, "Has anyone tried coming off Lyrica?" The thread had 47 replies within a week. Every single reply described the same experience, an attempt to reduce or stop the medication, followed by symptoms so severe that they had gone back on it. Several described being told by their doctors that the return of symptoms confirmed they needed the drug. 2 described being told explicitly that Pregabalin was not addictive and that what they were feeling could not be withdrawal. The thread was read by thousands of people. It was not read by anyone at Pfizer. It was not read by anyone at the FDA or at the MHRA. It existed in the part of the internet where patients go when medicine doesn't have answers, quiet, ungoverned, and full of data that no one was collecting. The question forming in that forum, in that moment, was the same question forming in the harm reduction centres in Dublin and the custody suites in Belfast, expressed in completely different language by completely different people who would never meet each other. Why does stopping feel like this? To understand why Pregabalin spread the way it did, it helps to understand what it actually felt like, not in the language of clinical trials, but in the language of the body. The drug reaches peak concentration in the blood within an hour of swallowing a capsule. There is no dramatic onset, no rush of the kind associated with opioids or stimulants. What happens instead is subtler and, for that reason, more insidious. The nervous system, which in people with chronic pain or anxiety has been running at a sustained elevated pitch, like an engine revving too high for too long, gradually perceptibly drops to idle. Muscles that have been held tense release in increments. The hypervigilance that chronic pain produces, the constant monitoring of one's own body for the next wave of discomfort, quiets. For people who have lived inside that state for months or years, the effect is not euphoria. It is closer to recognizing for the first time in a long time what normal feels like. That recognition is extraordinarily powerful, and it is the first mechanism of dependency. Pregabalin binds to a specific receptor in the brain called the alpha-2 delta subunit of voltage-gated calcium channels, which in plain language means it sits on the doorway through which certain nerve cells receive their signals to fire. By blocking that doorway, it reduces the release of several neurotransmitters simultaneously: glutamate, norepinephrine, and substance P, among others. The result is a broad dampening of excitatory activity across the central nervous system. The brain becomes, in measurable, quantifiable terms, less reactive. This is precisely why it worked for epilepsy, for nerve pain, for anxiety. It is also precisely why the body fights back. The brain does not accept suppression passively. Over days and weeks of regular pregabalin use, the nervous system upregulates. It produces more excitatory receptors, increases its sensitivity to stimulation, and raises its baseline firing rate to compensate for the drug's dampening effect. The technical term for this process is neuroadaptation. The practical consequence is that the person now requires the drug simply to feel normal, because their brain's new normal has been calibrated around the drug's presence. Remove the drug, and the compensatory hyperexcitability has nothing to counteract it. The nervous system fires without restraint. This is not addiction in the behavioral sense, the craving, the seeking, the loss of control over use. This is physical dependence, which can develop in any person who takes the drug regularly for long enough, regardless of their psychology, their history, or their intention. The distinction matters enormously because it means that patients who followed their prescriptions precisely, who took exactly what their doctor told them to take for exactly as long as they were told, could become physically dependent without doing anything wrong. Sarah Connolly was one of those patients. By 2007, she had been on Pregabalin for 2 years. Her dose was 150 milligrams twice daily, and it was, by every visible measure, working. She'd returned to full-time teaching. The pain that had sent her to the doctor in the first place was managed to the point where she rarely thought about it during the school day. Her colleagues noticed she seemed more present. She noticed it herself, a return of the concentration and patience that chronic pain had eroded over years. She started running again on weekends, something she hadn't done since her late 20s. There was one detail she mentioned to nobody. She had started keeping a spare capsule in the small zipped pocket of her handbag, separate from the main blister pack. She put it there after a Tuesday in March 2007, when she had accidentally left her morning dose on the kitchen counter and noticed, by 11 o'clock, that the skin on her forearms felt strange, tight and slightly electric, as if she'd been out in cold wind. She took the spare capsule in the staff toilet between lessons. The feeling resolved within 40 minutes. She told herself it was sensible preparation. She refilled the spare capsule every morning from then on. That single behavioural change, the spare capsule, the insurance, told a physiological story that Sarah could not yet read. Declan Farrell, by 2007, had moved beyond the casual use that had characterized his first year with the drug. He was sourcing Pregabalin from 2 different online pharmacies, one based in India, one in the Netherlands, and taking 300 milligrams most evenings, occasionally more on weekends. He had not experienced anything he would have described as a high. What he experienced was the removal of a discomfort he hadn't known was there before the drug revealed it by contrast. Stopping, which he had tried twice, produced 3 days of sleeplessness, leg cramps severe enough to wake him at 3 a.m., and a pervasive, unlocatable dread. Not sadness, not anxiety in any form he recognized, just a dark atmospheric pressure that sat behind his eyes and didn't lift. Both times, he had gone back to the pills before the 4th day arrived. He was still coaching football on Friday evenings. He was still showing up to work. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, the architecture of his daily life had been quietly reorganized around the drug's schedule. Meanwhile, what the medical community understood about Pregabalin was still being shaped almost entirely by information that came from a single source: Pfizer's clinical trial data and the prescribing guidelines built on top of it. Independent research on the drug's long-term effects was sparse in the early years, for the simple reason that independent research takes time and funding, and the drug was new. GPS prescribing Lyrica in 2006 and 2007 were working from a package insert that described the risk of dependence in language so qualified and hedged that it registered, in practice, as negligible. The insert used the phrase physical dependence once in a subsection, and noted that abrupt discontinuation could produce symptoms including insomnia, nausea, headache, and diarrhea. This was accurate as far as it went. It didn't mention seizures. It did not mention the burning skin that patients were describing online. It didn't mention the psychological dimension of withdrawal, the specific consuming anxiety that hit patients on day 2 or 3, and that many described as unlike anything they had experienced before, a category of distress for which they had no existing reference point. The insert described a tapering period of 1 week as sufficient for discontinuation. Patients who had tried tapering over a week, and there were many of them in that online forum and others like it across the internet, described 1 week as barely enough to begin. Some described months-long tapers that still produced severe symptoms. The gap between the official guidance and the lived experience of the people taking the drug was already substantial by 2007, and it was being documented in plain text by thousands of patients who had no particular agenda, no pharmaceutical interest, and no reason to exaggerate. That documentation existed outside the systems that medicine used to monitor drug safety. Adverse event reporting, the official mechanism through which problems with medications were flagged, required patients or doctors to submit formal reports to regulatory agencies. The process was voluntary, complicated, and systematically underused. Studies of adverse event reporting estimated that fewer than 10% of genuine adverse events were ever formally submitted. The forum posts, the message board threads, the detailed accounts of withdrawal that patients were writing for each other because their doctors couldn't help them. None of it fed into the regulatory data that would have triggered a reassessment of Pregabalin's safety profile. The signal was there. The receiver wasn't tuned to pick it up. In 2007, the year Sarah Connolly started keeping a spare capsule in her handbag, a researcher at King's College London named Dr. James Afolabi began a project that had nothing to do with Pregabalin. He was studying prescription drug trends in South London, mapping which medications were appearing at what rates in which neighbourhoods, looking for correlations between prescribing patterns and socio-economic indicators. It was methodical, unglamorous work, the kind that produces data sets rather than headlines. Somewhere in the second year of data collection, a pattern appeared that he hadn't anticipated. Pregabalin prescriptions were concentrating geographically in ways that didn't match the distribution of the conditions it was licensed to treat. Diabetic nerve pain and epilepsy had known demographic and geographic profiles. The Pregabalin numbers didn't follow those profiles. They were higher in areas of higher deprivation, tracking not with the disease burden but with something else, something that the data alone couldn't name. Afolabi flagged it in his notes. He set it aside. He kept collecting. And in a Pfizer regional sales office in the English Midlands, a weekly performance report showed that Lyrica prescriptions in the UK had crossed a threshold. 1 million scripts per year, ahead of internal projections. The report was marked with a green upward arrow. Nothing else was noted. The question nobody in that office was asking was where, precisely, all those prescriptions were going, and whether the patients receiving them had been told what would happen if they ever needed to stop. Dr. James Afolabi published his paper in March 2010. It ran to 22 pages in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, and its title was precise and deliberately understated: Pregabalin prescribing patterns in urban deprived populations, a signal worth investigating. The paper didn't claim to prove anything. It documented an anomaly, prescriptions concentrating in ways that the licensed indications couldn't explain, and called for further investigation. It named no companies. It made no accusations. It was, by the standards of academic publishing, a careful and measured piece of work. It received 11 citations in its first 2 years. None of them were from regulatory agencies. Pfizer didn't respond to the paper publicly. The MHRA, the UK's medicines regulator, did not issue any statement. The clinical guidelines for Pregabalin prescribing were not updated. The paper existed. It was indexed. It was accessible. It was findable by anyone who searched for it. And it changed nothing, which is its own kind of data point about how the system processed inconvenient signals. Afolabi moved on to other projects. He kept the data set. The same month his paper was published, a 19-year-old named Connor Doyle was found unresponsive in his bedroom in Derry, Northern Ireland. His mother had gone in at 9 a.m. because he hadn't appeared for breakfast, which was unusual. The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. Connor was pronounced dead at the hospital at 10:47 a.m. The toxicology report, completed 3 weeks later, showed pregabalin and alcohol. No other substances. The concentration of pregabalin in his blood was not extraordinary. It was within the range that many prescription patients maintained daily. Combined with alcohol, in a body that was young and had not built up tolerance through prescribed use, it had been enough. The coroner's report noted the combination. It recommended in a single sentence at the end of a 3-page document that awareness of pregabalin's interaction with alcohol be improved among young people. The report was filed. Connor's mother kept a copy in a manila folder on her kitchen table for years afterward, reading that single sentence periodically as if repetition might explain something it hadn't explained yet. No national alert was issued. No prescribing guidance was updated. The death was real and recorded and, within the machinery of public health surveillance, effectively invisible. This was not unique to pregabalin. Drug safety signals routinely took years to accumulate enough weight to trigger regulatory action, and the threshold for that action was set by systems designed in an era when the problem was underprescribing, not overprescribing. The adverse event reporting pipeline was slow, voluntary, and dependent on individual clinicians connecting a patient outcome to a specific drug, and then completing a form that many had neither the time nor the training to file correctly. By the time a signal became statistically significant in that system, it had usually been visible to anyone paying attention for years. The question was who had been paying attention, and what they had done with it. In 2009, 1 year before Connor Doyle died, Pfizer's internal pharmacovigilance team, the group responsible for monitoring safety signals in drugs already on the market, had received sufficient adverse event reports related to Pregabalin dependency to prepare an internal review document. This document, later obtained through litigation discovery in the United States, ran to 61 pages. It acknowledged that reports of physical dependence and withdrawal were occurring at rates that exceeded what had been anticipated from the clinical trial data. It recommended internally that the company's medical affairs team monitor the situation. It did not recommend updating the drug's label. It did not recommend notifying regulators. It recommended monitoring. The document was marked as confidential. It would not become public for another decade. Sarah Connolly tried to stop taking Pregabalin for the first time in January 2011. She had a specific reason. She was planning to try for a child, and she had read, in a patient information leaflet she found not in her pharmacy packaging but in an online search at midnight, that Pregabalin was associated with fetal abnormalities in animal studies and that women of childbearing age should use contraception while taking it. Her GP had not mentioned this. The original prescribing consultation in 2005 had not addressed it. She'd been 34 when she started. She was now 40. She reduced her dose by half over 4 days, following a schedule she had constructed from information gathered on the fibromyalgia forum rather than from her doctor. On the 5th day, she woke at 4 a.m. with her heart racing at a rate she could feel in her throat. The skin on her arms and legs was producing a sensation she could only describe as insects moving beneath it. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark of her bedroom and stayed very still, the way a person stays still when they're trying to assess whether what's happening is serious. By the 6th morning, she had not slept in 36 hours. Her hands shook visibly when she tried to pour water from the kettle. She called in sick to school for the first time in 4 years. Her GP saw her that afternoon. She described every symptom precisely and told him she had reduced her Pregabalin dose. He examined her, took her blood pressure, elevated but not critically, and delivered an assessment that would keep her dependent for 4 more years. He told her the fibromyalgia was flaring. He told her the nervous system symptoms she was experiencing were characteristic of the condition's unpredictable course. He wrote a new prescription restoring her to 150 milligrams twice daily and advised her to maintain her current dose rather than adjusting it without medical supervision. She went home and took the capsule. Within 2 hours the shaking had stopped. The skin sensation resolved. She slept that night for 9 hours and woke feeling, if not normal, then at least functional. And the physiological logic of that recovery, symptom onset during dose reduction, immediate resolution upon returning to the drug, was exactly the pattern of withdrawal and reinstatement. Her GP had seen the same sequence and read it as disease activity rather than drug dependency. The distinction between those two things, in the absence of knowledge about Pregabalin's withdrawal profile, was genuinely difficult to make. This is the particular horror of what was unfolding. The system was not failing through malice or negligence in individual cases. It was failing because the information required to make correct decisions had not reached the people making decisions, and the information had not reached them because the entity that possessed it had elected to keep it internal. In Wales, the pattern that Afolabi had identified in South London was more extreme and more visible. The South Wales valleys, communities built around coal mining, which had ended, and around industries that had followed, had some of the highest rates of Pregabalin prescribing in Europe by 2011. GPs in Merthyr Tydfil and Rhondda Cynon Taf were writing Pregabalin scripts at 3 times the Welsh average, which was itself above the UK average. Chronic pain in post-industrial communities was real and prevalent and undertreated, and Pregabalin was available, licensed, and reimbursable by the NHS, which meant it cost the patient nothing. It also meant that surplus prescriptions were moving through the community in both directions, from patients who had been prescribed more than they needed, and from patients who had found that their prescription had street value. A community pharmacist in Pontypridd noted, in a letter she sent to the local health board in late 2011, that she was filling Pregabalin prescriptions for patients she had never seen collect their prescriptions personally, and that on several occasions the person presenting at her counter had been unable to confirm basic details that a legitimate patient would know. She sent the letter. She received an acknowledgement. Nothing in her pharmacy's prescription volume changed in the months that followed. Declan Farrell in Belfast had by 2011 moved from online pharmacy procurement to a more direct and reliable source. A network of individuals who aggregated prescriptions from multiple patients and redistributed the surplus. He was now taking 600 milligrams daily, 4 times his starting dose, and had begun combining Pregabalin with codeine phosphate tablets, which were available over the counter at pharmacies in Ireland in 30-count packs. The combination, which he had discovered through experimentation rather than any deliberate research, produced something qualitatively different from either drug alone, a heaviness, a softening of everything that lasted several hours. He did not know, and had no way of knowing, that this combination was the one that was killing people. The pharmacological mechanism behind the danger had been documented in a Scottish study published in 2012, which found that Pregabalin and opioids together produced synergistic respiratory depression, meaning the combined suppression of breathing was not additive but multiplicative. 2 drugs, each at individually survivable doses, together created a respiratory burden the body could not manage. The study was published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was read by researchers. It was cited in subsequent papers. It was not incorporated into prescribing guidelines for another 3 years. In those 3 years, people died from that combination in numbers that the studies published later would describe, in the flat language of epidemiology, as preventable. Declan's girlfriend left in the autumn of 2012. She had, over the preceding year, noticed the specific quality of his unavailability, not aggression, not obvious intoxication, but a settled remoteness, a slightly delayed response time in conversation, a tendency to fall asleep in the early evening that no amount of sleep seemed to resolve. She didn't have the language for what she was observing because Pregabalin dependency didn't look like what people expected drug dependency to look like. He wasn't gaunt, he wasn't agitated, he held his job. The night she moved her belongings out, he sat in the flat and took an extra capsule. Not because he was distressed, or not only because of that, but because the body by then had its own logic, and the body said it was time. Sarah Connolly, that same autumn, stood in front of her Year 6 class on a Friday afternoon and blanked mid-sentence. She'd been explaining long division, and the next word simply wasn't there. She stood at the whiteboard for what felt like a long time but was probably 3 seconds, and then she found the thread and continued. None of the children noticed, but she noticed. She'd been noticing things like this, small lapses, minor hesitations, a slight softening of recall, for several months, and she had attributed them to age, to stress, to the accumulated weight of teaching 30 children for 20 years. She had not considered that the drug maintaining her nervous system at a sustained low frequency might be doing the same thing to her cognition. The MHRA, the UK medicines regulator, had received enough spontaneous adverse event reports about Pregabalin by 2012 to conduct an internal review. That review produced a document which concluded that the evidence for dependence and abuse was increasing and warranted continued surveillance. The document was not published. The prescribing guidelines were not updated. The word continued was doing significant work in that recommendation, implying that surveillance had already been ongoing in a way that the evidence suggested it had not. At the end of 2012, UK pharmacies filled 4.6 million prescriptions for Pregabalin. That was the number, 4.6 million. And the question that number raised, who were all those people, what were they taking it for, and what would happen to them when they tried to stop, had still not been formally asked by anyone with the authority to demand an answer. Inside HMP Berwyn, a Category C prison in North Wales that opened in 2017 and became one of the largest prisons in Europe, the currency was no longer tobacco. Tobacco had been declining as prison tender since the smoking ban in enclosed workplaces reached custodial settings. What replaced it, not gradually, but with the speed of any market that finds a more valuable commodity, was Pregabalin. A single 300 milligram capsule moved for £5 sterling. A week's prescription, if a prisoner could obtain one through the healthcare wing, was worth more than a day's prison wages. The mathematics were simple, and the consequences were not. Prisoners with legitimate prescriptions became targets. Those without prescriptions found other routes. Pregabalin arrived inside in quantities that baffled security staff, dissolved into liquid and painted onto paper, compressed into bindings of books, carried in the body cavities of visitors. The methods were inventive because the incentive was extraordinary. Pregabalin wasn't just being used recreationally inside the prison, it was sedating entire wings. Nurses in the healthcare unit reported finding prisoners in states of profound sedation that they initially attributed to illicit substances before the blood panels came back. The blood panels showed Pregabalin. The prison system was not an outlier, it was a mirror. What was happening inside Berwyn and dozens of other facilities across England and Wales was a concentrated, visible version of what was happening in communities outside. The drug moving through social networks, its value determined not by the experience of intoxication, but by the experience of its absence. People inside prisons needed Pregabalin for the same reason people outside needed it, because their bodies had adjusted to it, and the adjustment was not reversible without time and managed support that the system wasn't providing. The NHS, between 2012 and 2016, watched its Pregabalin prescription volume increase by 76%. The increase was not driven by a sudden epidemic of epilepsy or diabetic nerve pain. It was driven by off-label prescribing for anxiety and chronic pain, conditions for which the evidence base for Pregabalin was considerably weaker, and for which alternative treatments existed but required more time, more resources, or more specialist input than a GP appointment could accommodate. Pregabalin was fast, reimbursable, and produced measurable short-term improvement in patient-reported outcomes. The appointment was 10 minutes. The prescription was the path of least resistance, and GPs writing those prescriptions were not reckless. They were working within a system that had not updated its guidance, with a drug whose label had not changed, in a time when chronic pain and anxiety were rising, and specialist referral waiting lists ran to 18 months. In Scotland, a team of researchers at the University of Dundee published data in 2015 that should have been the moment everything changed. Their analysis of death records combined with prescription data found that individuals who had been prescribed Pregabalin were significantly more likely to appear in drug-related death statistics, and that the risk was dramatically elevated when Pregabalin was combined with opioid medication, a combination that, their data showed, was occurring in a substantial proportion of patients because both drugs were being prescribed simultaneously by the same GP, sometimes on the same day. The respiratory depression mechanism worked like this. Opioids suppressed breathing by acting on receptors in the brainstem. Pregabalin suppressed breathing through a different mechanism, acting through its calcium channel, binding to reduce the signalling that kept respiration regular. Together, they attacked the same system from two angles simultaneously. The brainstem, receiving suppressive signals from both pathways at once, sometimes simply stopped maintaining the respiratory drive that keeps a sleeping person breathing. They died in their sleep, many of them, and the death looked peaceful because the body, fully sedated, offered no resistance. The Dundee paper was published. It was noted. The prescribing of opioids and pregabalin in combination continued. Declan Farrell was arrested for the second time in April 2014. The charge was possession with intent to supply, not pregabalin, which remained unscheduled, but codeine phosphate in quantities that exceeded personal use. He was held overnight and released on bail. In the custody suite, a duty nurse asked him about his medication use. He listed pregabalin. The nurse wrote it down. Nothing in the custody procedure at that point required any assessment of dependency or any referral to addiction services for pregabalin, because pregabalin was not on the controlled substances list that triggered those procedures. He was processed and released. The charge was eventually reduced and he received a fine. He paid it over 3 months in installments from his warehouse wages. By this point, he was taking 900 milligrams of pregabalin daily. The standard therapeutic dose for nerve pain was 150 to 600 milligrams. He was at the ceiling of even the highest prescribed doses, obtaining the excess through his network, spending approximately £200 a month on the drug, money that came from wages, from occasional odd jobs, and from arrangements he didn't discuss with people outside the network. He was 28 years old. He still coached football on Friday evenings, though he had moved down to the under-8s because the commitment was lighter. The under-8s didn't notice anything. Their parents sometimes noticed he seemed tired. In the same year, Declan's GP, whom he visited twice annually for blood pressure checks, having developed mild hypertension, prescribed him pregabalin, not for pain, for anxiety, which Declan had mentioned in passing during one appointment as difficulty sleeping. The GP, unaware that Declan was already taking pregabalin sourced elsewhere, wrote a prescription for 75 milligrams twice daily. Declan filled it. He added it to what he was already taking. His medical record now showed him as a legitimate pregabalin patient at a low therapeutic dose. The actual dose he was taking was 12 times that. The two realities coexisted in parallel, and the system had no mechanism for detecting the gap between them. The Belfast coroner's report, published in the spring of 2016, was not technically a new finding. Everything in it had been documented somewhere before, in academic papers, in harm reduction caseworker notes, in hospital discharge records. What the report did was aggregate. It took the scattered data from individual deaths, individual toxicology screens, individual case files, and arranged them into a single table that was impossible to misread. 33% of all drug-related deaths in Northern Ireland in 2015 involved pregabalin. More than heroin, more than benzodiazepines, more than any single substance except, in some months, alcohol. The deaths were concentrated in two demographic bands, men aged 20 to 35 and men-women aged 45 to 65. The younger group was predominantly non-prescribed users. The older group was, in a significant proportion of cases, people who had been prescribed the drug legitimately and had died during periods of combined use with other prescribed medications. The coroner called it a public health emergency in the document's executive summary. She used those words precisely. The report reached the desk of a senior pharmacovigilance officer at the MHRA named Dr. Helen Marsh in the summer of 2016. She'd been at the agency for 11 years. She'd managed the regulatory review of several substances that had subsequently been reclassified, and she understood the timeline those processes typically followed. the gathering of evidence, the consultation period, the industry submissions, the final decision. She'd seen it take 4 years. She'd seen it take 7. She read the Belfast report in a single sitting. Then she opened the MHRA's internal database of Pregabalin adverse event reports and ran a query she'd run before, but not recently. The numbers had changed substantially since the last time. The dependency and withdrawal reports had more than doubled in 24 months. She printed the results and added them to the Belfast report in a folder she labelled simply with the drug's name. Then she picked up the phone. The call she made was to a contact at Pfizer's Medical Affairs Division, standard procedure when a regulator was beginning a formal review process, a notification of intent before the official process began. The conversation, as later reconstructed from her notes, was brief and professional. The Pfizer contact acknowledged the call. He said the company would engage fully with any regulatory process. What happened in the weeks following that call would not become clear until a journalist began asking the right questions 2 years later. What is clear is that the formal MHRA reclassification review, which should by any reasonable reading of the Belfast data have begun immediately, did not produce a final decision for another 2.5 years. 2.5 years. The question of what happened in that gap, who made which submissions, who applied which pressures, which meetings were held in which rooms and which recommendations were delayed for which stated reasons, is a question the official record answers only partially. Sarah Connolly's sister, Claire, dragged her to an addiction specialist in Leeds in February 2015. Dragged is not an overstatement. Sarah had declined twice before, insisting that her Pregabalin use was medical, prescribed, and managed. Claire had watched her sister for 3 years with increasing unease, noting the specific way Sarah's hands moved when she was approaching the time for her next dose, a slight restlessness, a repeated checking of the time that Sarah seemed unaware she was doing. Claire was not a medical professional. She was a secondary school librarian. But she had spent enough time around her sister to know that what she was watching was not the behaviour of someone managing a chronic condition. It was the behaviour of someone managing an absence. The specialist, a consultant psychiatrist named Dr. Priya Mehta, who ran an addiction medicine clinic at the Leeds and York Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, spent 90 minutes with Sarah at the initial assessment. She was measured, unhurried, and precise. By the end of the session, she had reached a conclusion that she communicated carefully. Sarah was physically dependent on Pregabalin, not psychologically addicted. She was not seeking euphoria, was not taking the drug compulsively in ways that overrode her judgment, but her nervous system had adapted to the drug's presence so thoroughly that removing it would require a slow, medically supervised taper that she estimated would take between 6 and 18 months, depending on how Sarah's body responded. She used the word dependent, not addicted. The distinction was deliberate and important because it shifted the nature of the situation from a question of character to a question of physiology. Sarah sat with that for a moment. Then she asked how this had happened. Dr. Mehta told her, as simply as she could, that the drug's label had not adequately conveyed the risk of physical dependence with long-term use, and that this was a known gap, known in the research literature, known in the clinical community, that had not yet been translated into the guidance that GPS received. A known gap. Sarah had been sitting inside a known gap for 10 years. She drove home in silence. She did not tell Claire what the appointment had found, not that evening. She sat in her kitchen after dinner and looked at the blister pack on the counter, the Tuesday evening dose, the one she always took at 7, and she took it because Dr. Mehta had told her not to change anything until the supervised taper began. The taper was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. Somewhere in Belfast, in a flat where the central heating had been broken since October, Declan Farrell was making a calculation about how much of the month's budget he could redirect toward Pregabalin. The answer, as it had been for several months, was most of it. The document that changed everything had been sitting in a regulatory filing for 14 years before anyone outside Pfizer read it carefully. In 2019, a Freedom of Information request submitted by a pharmaceutical accountability researcher in the United States resulted in the release of a portion of Pfizer's original FDA submission for Pregabalin, the package of data, studies and analyses the company had submitted in support of the 2004 approval. The full submission ran to approximately 47,000 pages. Most of those pages had never been read by anyone outside the regulatory agencies that received them, because most of those pages were not the summary documents that reviewers prioritized. They were appendices, supporting data, the detailed substrate beneath the conclusions. In Appendix 7 of Volume 31 of that submission, there was a section describing animal studies conducted during Pregabalin's preclinical development phase, the test run on rats and mice before the drug ever entered a human body. The section documented standard toxicology findings. It also documented something that was not standard. In studies where animals were administered Pregabalin at therapeutic equivalent doses for extended periods and then had the drug withdrawn, the animals displayed seizure activity. Not all of them, a statistically significant proportion of them. Seizures on withdrawal, in animals, before the drug was ever approved for humans. The finding had been included in the submission because regulatory rules required complete disclosure. It had been placed in an appendix because nothing in those rules specified where in a 47,000-page document a finding had to appear. The FDA reviewers who processed the submission had worked from the executive summaries and core study reports. The appendix finding was present, technically visible, and practically buried. Pfizer's own pharmacologist had seen animals seize when Pregabalin was removed. They had proceeded to market a drug whose label described a 1-week taper as sufficient for discontinuation. This was the first thing the researcher found. The second was worse. Buried in a separate section of the same submission was the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the pivotal clinical trials. The trials whose data form the foundation of every safety claim on the drug's label, including the claim of low abuse potential. The exclusion criteria listed, among other things, a current or recent history of alcohol or substance use disorder. This was, as noted earlier, standard practice. But the researchers who had designed the trials had gone further than standard practice. They had also excluded patients with a history of anxiety disorders beyond the specific type being studied, patients with significant psychiatric comorbidities, and patients currently taking other centrally acting medications. The result was a trial population that was, by design, among the least likely people in the world to develop problems with Pregabalin. The label that emerged from those trials, low abuse potential, manageable discontinuation, was an accurate description of a drug given to a population that had been carefully constructed to not demonstrate its dangers. The people who would actually take Pregabalin in the real world, people with complex pain histories, people with anxiety, people with prior substance use, people on opioids for chronic pain, had been excluded from the data used to describe the drug's safety to their doctors. This was not fraud in the legal sense. Every exclusion criterion had been disclosed. The methodology was documented. But the gap between the studied population and the prescribed population was so large, and the consequences of that gap so severe, that the distinction between legal methodology and practical deception had become almost theoretical. The researcher published her findings in a health policy journal in late 2019. By that point, the UK had already reclassified Pregabalin as a Class C controlled substance. The decision had taken effect in April of that year, and the story had begun receiving mainstream press attention. Her paper added a layer to the narrative that the press coverage had not yet reached. Not just that the drug had caused harm, but that the data used to approve it had been structured in a way that made harm invisible until it was happening at scale. But to understand why the reclassification took until 2019, and why even that timeline was not the product of regulatory urgency, it is necessary to go back to 2016 and the months following Dr. Helen Marsh's phone call to Pfizer's Medical Affairs Division. The formal MHRA review process for Pregabalin's controlled substance status began in the autumn of 2016. It was not announced publicly. It proceeded through internal working groups, expert committee meetings, and a consultation process that by law required industry input. Pfizer submitted a response to the consultation. That response, obtained later through parliamentary questions, ran to over 200 pages and made several arguments. That reclassification would create barriers for legitimate patients, that the evidence base for abuse was concentrated in specific geographic and demographic groups rather than the general population, and that existing mechanisms for monitoring prescribing were sufficient to address the identified risks. The arguments were not without basis. Reclassification of a drug as a controlled substance does create additional administrative burden for prescribers and pharmacists, and there was genuine concern among pain specialists that it would reduce access for patients with legitimate need. These concerns were real. They were also, in the context of the harm data by that point on the table, inadequate. The MHRA's Expert Advisory Committee met 3 times between late 2016 and early 2018. Each meeting produced minutes that described ongoing assessment and further evidence gathering. The Belfast report was on the table at every meeting. The Dundee respiratory depression data was on the table. Afolabi's original 2010 paper was on the table, along with his updated analyses. The evidence base was not thin. The process nonetheless took 28 months from the start of formal review to the announcement of reclassification. During those 28 months, Pregabalin prescriptions in the UK continued to rise. The drug's presence in drug-related death statistics continued to increase. The street market continued to operate. None of this was hidden. All of it was being published in public health reports and coroner's data that anyone could access. A journalist named Fiona Gallagher, who covered health policy for a national newspaper, had been tracking the Pregabalin story since 2017. She had obtained the MHRA consultation documents through a Freedom of Information request, had spoken to harm reduction workers, had reviewed the coroner data, and had attempted to interview former Pfizer Medical Affairs employees about the 2016 consultation process. Most declined. One agreed to speak without being identified. What that source told her, and what she documented in notes that have since been referenced in parliamentary evidence, was that the MHRA's deliberation process had involved direct and sustained engagement from Pfizer's regulatory affairs and legal teams, at a level of intensity that sources inside the agency described as unusual, even by the standards of contested reclassification reviews. Meetings had been requested. Submissions had been supplemented with additional materials. Legal frameworks around the commercial impact of reclassification had been cited. None of this was illegal. All of it was within the normal operation of a regulatory consultation process that was designed to include industry input. But the effect, in the reading of people inside the process, had been delay. Not deliberate obstruction, delay. The careful, procedurally correct, legally defensible slowing of a process that the harm data said should have concluded faster. Fiona Gallagher filed her story in March 2018. Her editor received a call from Pfizer's legal department on the morning of the day it was due to be published. The call raised concerns about specific characterizations in the piece and requested a delay in publication for further review. The editor declined. The story ran the same afternoon. Pfizer issued a statement describing the company's full cooperation with all regulatory processes and emphasizing that Pregabalin's benefits for patients with legitimate medical need were well established. The statement was 4 paragraphs. It did not address the animal study findings. It did not address the trial exclusion criteria. It did not address the 2009 internal pharmacovigilance document. That document, the 61-page internal review from 2009, the one that acknowledged dependency reports were exceeding expectations and recommended monitoring rather than label updates, had not yet become public at the time of Fiona Gallagher's story. It would emerge through litigation discovery in a US class action case in 2020. When it did, it answered a question that had been sitting under the entire story since the beginning. When had Pfizer known that Pregabalin's dependency profile was more serious than the label described? The answer, in the date stamp on the document, was 2009, 5 years before the Welsh prescribing cluster, 7 years before the Belfast coroner's report, 10 years before reclassification. The company had known, in a document its own scientists produced, that the drug was creating dependency at rates the label did not reflect. And the label had not been updated. The revelation arrived in the public record in 2020. By then, the people who had lived through the consequences of that gap, the patients, the families, the harm reduction workers, the coroners, had been living through them for a decade. The document confirmed what the death statistics had been suggesting since at least 2012. It confirmed what Afolabi's 2010 paper had flagged. It confirmed what the patients on the fibromyalgia forums had been documenting in plain language since 2007. What it could not confirm, what no document could confirm, was what the outcome would have been if the label had been updated in 2009. Whether earlier warning language would have changed prescribing behaviour, whether a 1-week taper recommendation becoming a 6-month taper recommendation would have prevented the seizures, the respiratory arrests, the overdoses, whether Connor Doyle in Derry would still be alive. These are the questions that live in the gap between what was known and what was disclosed, and they do not have clean answers. What they have instead is a parliamentary inquiry, a reclassification that arrived a decade late, and a database of adverse event reports that by 2018 had grown to a size that the original 2009 internal review had described as a situation requiring monitoring. The monitoring had continued. The harm had continued alongside it. And somewhere in a Leeds hospital in the summer of 2018, the monitoring of a different kind had just reached its limit. Sarah Connolly had been attempting to taper off Pregabalin for 3 years by the summer of 2018. Not continuously. The process had been interrupted twice by episodes severe enough to require her to stabilise before reducing again. Dr. Mehta had restructured the taper schedule after the first interruption, slowing the reduction rate to 10 milligrams every 2 weeks, rather than the 25 milligrams per week they had started with. The second interruption had slowed it further still. By July 2018, Sarah was at 75 milligrams daily, down from her peak of 300 milligrams, a reduction that had taken 31 months and had produced, at various points along the way, insomnia lasting 4 consecutive days. A burning sensation in her legs so persistent she had slept with ice packs wrapped in tea towels against her calves, and a period of 6 weeks in the spring of 2017 when she'd been unable to drive because her reaction times were unreliable. She'd continued teaching through most of it. This was the detail that her sister Claire found almost impossible to comprehend afterward. That Sarah had stood in front of 30 10-year-olds every weekday, while her nervous system was being slowly rebuilt from the inside. The decision to attempt the final reduction from 75 milligrams to nothing was made jointly between Sarah and Dr. Mehta in late June 2018. Mehta was cautious. She outlined the risks, scheduled weekly check-in calls, and gave Sarah a written protocol specifying that if certain symptoms appeared, she was to call the clinic immediately rather than wait for the next appointment. On the morning of July 14th, Sarah took her last Pregabalin capsule. By the fourth day, she recognized the familiar architecture of withdrawal, the disrupted sleep, the heightened sensitivity to sound, the feeling that the air in her flat had a texture it didn't normally have. These she had experienced before and had learned to navigate. What arrived on the seventh day was different. She woke at 6 a.m. to find herself on the floor of her bedroom. She had no memory of falling. The left side of her face was pressed against the carpet and her arm, folded beneath her, had gone entirely numb. It took her several seconds to understand what had happened. Then she felt the soreness in her jaw, the specific deep ache of muscles that had clenched involuntarily, and she understood. She had seized in her sleep. The ambulance crew arrived 17 minutes after Claire, who had a key, entered the flat and found her sister sitting on the floor with her back against the bed, still in the previous night's clothes, holding her own wrist as if checking a pulse. The paramedics assessed her, established she was post-ictal, the state of neurological exhaustion that follows a seizure, and took her to Leeds General Infirmary. In the emergency department, the attending physician reviewed her medication history. He saw the Pregabalin taper. He saw the timeline. He made the connection without hesitation, because by July 2018, Pregabalin withdrawal seizures had become familiar enough in emergency medicine that most attending physicians in UK hospitals recognised the presentation immediately. This was not because the medical education system had caught up. It was because the volume of cases had become so high that clinical recognition had developed through sheer exposure. She was admitted. The seizure had been the nervous system's response to the sudden removal of the substance that had been moderating its activity for 13 years. Even at 75 milligrams, a dose many clinicians would have considered low, the dependency was complete enough that the final step had been too large for her brain to absorb without breaking. Dr. Mehta visited the ward the following morning. She reviewed the case notes, sat with Sarah for 30 minutes, and revised the taper plan. Sarah would restart at 25 milligrams and reduce by 5 milligrams every 3 weeks, under closer monitoring. The revised timeline for full cessation was now a minimum of 8 additional months. Sarah did not cry in the hospital. She'd used up something in the 3 previous years that crying requires, a kind of energy for grief. She looked at the ceiling of the ward and asked Dr. Mehta one specific question, whether, at any point in the process, this outcome had been avoidable. Mehta's answer was careful and true. She said that with earlier identification, with different prescribing guidance, with label information that reflected what was in the animal studies, the dependency might have been caught before it reached 13 years. She said might. She did not say definitely. She was a precise person. Sarah's hospitalisation was one of 270 cases in the UK that year, where Pregabalin was recorded as a primary or contributing factor in a serious adverse medical event. The figure comes from the NHS digital data published in 2019. It does not capture every case, only those where the drug was formally recorded in the clinical notes as relevant, which required a clinician to make that connection and document it, a step that remained inconsistent across trusts. The actual number was higher. How much higher, nobody could say with precision. In the same month, Sarah was admitted to Leeds General. The Parliamentary Health and Social Care Committee opened a formal inquiry into prescription drug dependency. The inquiry had been prompted partly by the benzodiazepine scandal, the decades-long overprescribing of Valium and its successors, and partly by the accumulating Pregabalin data, which campaigners had been pushing into parliamentary awareness for 2 years through a combination of petitions, constituency correspondence, and the sustained advocacy of bereaved families who had lost people to Pregabalin-related deaths and had found the official response inadequate. The committee heard testimony over several months. Former patients described withdrawal experiences that lasted years. GPS testified that they had not been adequately informed about dependency risk at the time they were prescribing. Addiction specialists presented the mortality data. Harm reduction workers described the street market in terms that shocked committee members who had assumed Pregabalin was primarily a medical issue rather than a community one. Dr. James Afolabi testified in October 2018. He brought his original 2010 paper and the updated analysis he had published in 2017, which tracked the trajectory of the crisis across 8 years. A committee member asked him directly when the signal had first been strong enough to warrant regulatory action. He said 2010. The same member asked what had happened in 2010. Afolabi said his paper had been published. He said nothing else. The silence after that answer lasted long enough to be noted in the official transcript. No Pfizer representative testified before the committee. The company submitted a written statement emphasizing its commitment to patient safety and its full cooperation with all regulatory bodies. The statement was 6 paragraphs. It mentioned the word patients 11 times. In Belfast, on the 3rd of March 2018, Declan Farrell did not show up for his shift at the warehouse. His supervisor called his mobile at 8:15 a.m. No answer. At 9 a.m, the supervisor called again. The neighbour who lived below Declan's flat had noticed sometime around 7:30 a.m. that the television in the flat above had been running at low volume since she woke at 6, which was not unusual, but that there had been no sound of movement, no footsteps, no bathroom sounds, none of the morning noise of a person preparing for their day. The neighbour called 999 at 9:20 a.m. The paramedics found Declan on his sofa. He was 32 years old, breathing shallowly at a rate of 7 breaths per minute, less than half the normal rate for a resting adult. His lips had a faint bluish tinge that the crew recognised before they were through the door. Empty blister packs on the coffee table, Pregabalin, 300 milligrams, and codeine phosphate. A half-empty can of beer on the floor beside the sofa, still upright, which suggested he had placed it there deliberately rather than dropped it. They administered naloxone, the opioid reversal agent, which partially reversed the codeine's respiratory suppression, but had no effect on Pregabalin, because Pregabalin does not work through opioid receptors. The naloxone bought minutes. The oxygen mask and the drive to the Royal Victoria Hospital did the rest. He was intubated in the resuscitation bay. He spent 41 hours in intensive care. When he was moved to a general ward on the 3rd day, he was asked by a junior doctor who was completing the admission paperwork to describe his typical daily Pregabalin use. The number he gave, 900 milligrams, sometimes more, produced a pause in the doctor's note-taking that lasted several seconds. The doctor asked him to confirm the figure. He confirmed it. The doctor wrote it down and moved to the next question. In the United States, the parallel crisis was running several years behind the UK in regulatory terms, but ahead of it in scale. Gabapentin, Pregabalin's predecessor, still largely unscheduled at the federal level, was by 2018 the 5th most prescribed drug in the country, with over 64 million prescriptions written annually. Studies from Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee, states already devastated by the opioid crisis, found gabapentin present in between 20 and 30% of opioid overdose deaths. It was not killing people on its own in those cases. It was doing what the Dundee researchers had described 3 years earlier, amplifying opioid toxicity, converting survivable overdoses into fatal ones, operating as an invisible multiplier in a crisis that was already beyond control. 41 US states had no scheduling for gabapentin at the federal level as of 2018. 17 states had moved to add monitoring requirements. The remainder were watching. The UK reclassification announcement came in October 2017 and was scheduled to take effect on April 1, 2019. 18 months of lead time, a period designed to allow prescribers and pharmacies to adapt their systems to the new controlled substance requirements. What it also allowed was for anyone paying attention to place a large Pregabalin order before the administrative complexity of controlled substance status made it harder to do so. Prescription volumes in the final quarter, before reclassification, increased by 11%. The regulatory action intended to reduce the drug's availability produced, in its announcement period, a spike in the very prescribing it was designed to curtail. The irony was documented in the NHS digital quarterly data and was noted by several researchers in letters to medical journals. It was not noted in any official statement from the MHRA or the Department of Health. By April 2019, when the new classification finally took effect, Pregabalin had been on the UK market for 15 years. It had generated, over the lifetime of Pfizer's patent, approximately $21 billion in global revenue. It had been present in, by conservative estimates, over 1,000 drug-related deaths in the UK alone. It had created physical dependency in an unknown but substantial number of patients who had taken it exactly as prescribed. It had established itself in street drug markets across Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Northern England as firmly as any substance with decades of illicit history. And on the day the reclassification took effect, April 1st, 2019, a pharmacist in Leeds dispensed a new Pregabalin prescription to a patient who had been referred by their GP for nerve pain following a back surgery the previous month. The pharmacist applied the new controlled drug label to the bag. The patient took it home. They swallowed the first capsule that evening. The question of whether that patient was told, clearly specifically in language that would stay with them, what the drug could do to their nervous system over time, and what stopping it would require, is a question whose answer depended entirely on whether their GP had been given guidance that the system had spent 15 years failing to produce. The reclassification changed the paperwork. It did not change the dependency. In the 12 months following April 2019, Pregabalin prescription volumes in the UK dropped by approximately 8%, a reduction that researchers described as modest given the scale of the intervention, and that clinicians on the ground described as almost imperceptible in daily practice. The controlled substance designation meant that prescriptions now required a handwritten signature rather than an electronic one in some settings, that pharmacies maintained additional records, that repeat prescriptions could no longer be issued automatically without review. These were not trivial administrative changes. They were also not the structural shift that the mortality data had been demanding for a decade. The street market absorbed the regulatory change with minimal disruption. Pregabalin's price on the street had actually fallen in the years around reclassification because the flood of generic manufacturers that entered the market when Pfizer's patent expired in 2019 had driven the production cost of each capsule to a fraction of what it had been under patent protection. Where Lyrica had been expensive and its diversion therefore commercially limited, generic Pregabalin was cheap enough that diversion became more economically viable, not less. The controlled substance status added friction to legitimate prescribing. It added almost none to the supply chains that had been operating outside legitimate prescribing for over a decade. Online pharmacies adapted. Some relocated their registration to jurisdictions with lighter oversight. Others implemented the minimum verification requirements that satisfied the letter of the law in their operating country, while maintaining the practical accessibility that had driven their business model. The people who had been sourcing Pregabalin through those channels before April 2019 continued sourcing it through those channels after April 2019, with minor adjustments. The harm reduction workers who had been tracking the street market since the early 2010s noted something specific about the post-reclassification period. The demographic profile of their Pregabalin clients shifted slightly. Fewer people presenting were obtaining the drug from a legitimate prescription that had run out or been stopped. More were obtaining it entirely through non-medical channels. The reclassification had, in effect, pushed a portion of dependent users further from the medical system at the moment they most needed to be inside it. Sarah Connolly completed her taper in February 2020. The final reduction, from 5 milligrams to nothing, was, paradoxically, one of the harder steps, even though the absolute amount of drug involved was small. Her nervous system, having been modulated by Pregabalin for 15 years and slowly recalibrated over 3 years of tapering, was still sensitive to the final removal in ways that a higher dose earlier in the process had not been. She experienced 2 weeks of disrupted sleep, a persistent low-grade headache that paracetamol did not touch, and a 3-day period of what she described to Claire as a kind of emotional static. Not sadness, not anxiety, but a pervasive sensory noise that made concentration difficult, and the ordinary details of a room, the sound of the refrigerator, the pattern on the kitchen tiles, seemed briefly, disconcertingly vivid. Then it passed. She had no Pregabalin in her system for the first time since the Tuesday morning in 2005 when she'd filled her first prescription. She was 49 years old. She had spent 15 years of her adult life physically dependent on a drug that her label had told her was unlikely to cause dependence. She had taught approximately 400 children during those 15 years, had maintained a career, had sustained relationships, had been, by every external measure, a functioning person. She described the end of the taper to Claire using a specific image. It was like learning that a sound you had lived with so long you thought it was silence had finally stopped, and the actual silence was something you had to learn to inhabit. Her fibromyalgia pain returned, partially. It was present but manageable, at levels she found tolerable with physiotherapy, a low-dose anti-inflammatory, and a structured exercise routine that Dr. Mehta had recommended for its effect on central sensitization. She went back to work full-time in March 2020, 1 week before the COVID-19 lockdown closed her school and sent her, along with every other teacher in the country, to teach from a laptop in her kitchen. The timing was almost absurd. She managed. In Dublin, Declan Farrell completed a 12-week residential treatment program in the autumn of 2019. The program was run by a charity in the Liberties area of the city, and it addressed both the Pregabalin dependency and the codeine used through a combination of medically supervised tapering and structured therapeutic support. He was 33 years old when he was discharged. He had, according to his discharge summary, engaged well with the program and demonstrated insight into his pattern of use. He had no Pregabalin in his system for the first time in 13 years. He relapsed in June 2020. The circumstances were not dramatic. There was no single event, no crisis that triggered the return to the drug. What there was instead was the specific, insidious return of the discomfort that Pregabalin had been suppressing, the anxiety that had never been formally diagnosed because he had never sought diagnosis, the low-grade restlessness that he had first medicated with that borrowed capsule in his friend's flat in 2006. The drug had, for 13 years, been treating a condition he didn't know he had, and the condition did not disappear when the drug did. It returned, and it waited. He obtained Pregabalin through a contact he had maintained from before treatment. He took it for 6 weeks before his key worker at the aftercare service identified the relapse through a routine drug screen. He returned to structured support. A second residential placement was identified, funded through a combination of HSE allocation and charity funding. he was placed on the waiting list in September 2020. In November 2020, the funding for the residential program he'd been allocated to was cut. The cut was part of a broader reallocation of health service resources in response to the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. Declan was removed from the residential pathway and offered community-based support instead. Weekly key worker sessions, a phone number for a crisis line, and a printed information sheet about local support groups. His last recorded contact with the service was December 14th, 2020. The key worker who had managed his case left the organisation in January 2021 due to burnout. The case was transferred to a new worker who attempted contact by phone twice and received no answer. The file was marked as lost to follow-up. Lost to follow-up. The clinical term for a person the system has stopped tracking. Pfizer's patent on Pregabalin expired in July 2019 in the United States and had expired in Europe the same year. Within 18 months, over 40 generic manufacturers were producing Pregabalin in various formulations. The drug's retail price collapsed. Pfizer moved its commercial focus to other products. The company's total revenue from Lyrica over the 15 years of its patent lifetime had reached approximately $21 billion globally, a figure that ranked it among the most commercially successful drugs in the company's history. The company that had made $21 billion from Pregabalin had no remaining financial interest in Pregabalin. The people whose nervous systems had been permanently altered by Pregabalin did not have the option of moving on to other products. Dr. James Afolabi published his follow-up paper in the spring of 2022. 12 years had passed since his original Signal paper in 2010. The new paper tracked the arc of the crisis from his original data set through to the post-reclassification period and drew conclusions that were, for academic writing, unusually direct. He wrote that the window of maximum intervention had been 2009, the year Pfizer's own internal documents, by then public through litigation, had identified the dependency signal as exceeding predictions. He wrote that everything after 2009 had been, in epidemiological terms, reactive management of a preventable trajectory. He used the word preventable twice. He did not use the word preventable 3 times. The paper received more citations in its first 6 months than his 2010 paper had received in 12 years. New prescribing guidelines for Pregabalin, updated by NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, in 2023 included for the first time explicit language about physical dependence, a recommended minimum taper duration of several months for long-term users, and a requirement that GPS document a discussion of dependency risk with patients before initiating Pregabalin treatment. The language was clear. It was also language that, had it appeared in the original 2004 guidance, would have reached Sarah Connolly's GP before we wrote her first prescription. Whether GPS were consistently implementing the new guidance was, as of the time of writing, unknown. Monitoring implementation of prescribing guidance in primary care requires a surveillance infrastructure that the NHS did not, in 2023, have fully operational. The guidance existed. The verification of its application did not. In the United States, gabapentin, the older, cheaper, still largely unscheduled cousin of Pregabalin, remained federally uncontrolled. As of 2024, only 14 states had moved it to Schedule 5 or implemented prescription monitoring requirements. The remaining 36 states maintained no mandatory tracking. The prescription volume had reached 70 million annual scripts, making it one of the most prescribed drugs in the country. The percentage of opioid overdose deaths in which gabapentin was detected as a contributing factor had continued to rise. The crisis that had visibly detonated in the UK between 2012 and 2018 was, in the United States, still in the phase that the UK had been in around 2010, the phase where the signal was present in the data, the papers were being published, the harm reduction workers were documenting it in their casework, and the regulatory machinery was moving at its own pace toward a decision whose timeline bore no relationship to the speed at which people were dying. The pattern was identical, the decade had simply shifted. And in countries across Eastern Europe, in parts of Southeast Asia, in regions where Pregabalin and gabapentin had arrived, with the global generic manufacturing wave, and where regulatory capacity was thinner and monitoring infrastructure was sparse or absent, the very beginning of the curve was just becoming visible. A slight uptick in harm reduction referrals, a first coroner's report, a first academic paper identifying an anomalous pattern in prescription data that didn't match the licensed disease burden. A signal worth investigating. The same words Afolabi had used in 2010. In new places, about the same drug. The Belfast morgue from the winter of 2016 looks, in photographs taken for the coroner's administrative records, exactly as morgues look. Institutional, fluorescent, stripped of everything unnecessary. The chief pathologist who published the report that stopped her colleagues mid-sentence is still working. She published a follow-up analysis in 2021. The numbers in that analysis were larger than the numbers that had shocked people in 2016. She noted this without commentary. That is her professional obligation. It is also, in its own way, a complete statement. The viewer who has followed this story from the beginning now stands in a different relationship to that morgue than they did at the start. In the first minutes of this story, the statistic was the point. Pregabalin in more bodies than heroin, a number designed to arrest attention. Now the number has a history. It has a laboratory in Illinois in 1990 and a licensing agreement and a 47,000-page regulatory submission with an appendix that nobody prioritized. It has a $430 million settlement that changed nothing about what came next. It has a 2009 internal document marked confidential. It has a 2.5-year regulatory delay. It has a pharmacist in Pontypridd whose letter was acknowledged and then ignored. It has a forum thread from 2005 with 47 replies that nobody in a position of authority read. The number in the morgue is not a statistic that appeared from nowhere. It was built, incrementally, from decisions made at identifiable moments by identifiable people in identifiable rooms. That is what is different now. Pregabalin is being prescribed today. Not historically. Today, in the present tense, in the same countries where the crisis was documented, by GPs working from updated guidance that is better than what existed in 2005, but that remains imperfectly implemented and inconsistently communicated. Patients are receiving their first prescription right now, some of them with a clear explanation of what long-term use can do to their nervous system, some of them with a leaflet they will not read until something goes wrong. The drug is real, the relief it provides is real, and the dependency it can create is real, and all three of those things are simultaneously true for the person swallowing the first capsule tonight. Every 90 seconds, a new Pregabalin prescription is written in the United Kingdom alone. That figure comes from NHS prescription data for 2023. It has decreased from its peak. The reclassification, the updated guidance, the accumulated public awareness have collectively bent the curve. But the curve has not reversed. It has moderated. And moderated in the context of a drug present in the toxicology of hundreds of deaths per year is a word that requires careful examination before it is mistaken for resolved. Declan Farrell told his key worker something at their last recorded meeting in December 2020 that the key worker documented in the case notes. The note is brief, a single sentence, written in the clinical shorthand of a caseworker completing paperwork at the end of a long day. But the substance of what Declan said, as reconstructed from that note, is this: that he had never made a decision to take Pregabalin. The first time he took it, it was handed to him. The second time, his body asked for it and he complied. Every time after that, the asking and the complying had merged until the distinction ceased to exist. He had never, at any point, chosen Pregabalin the way a person chooses something they want. He had simply, at each relevant moment, had no workable alternative. His current status is unknown. The file has not been updated since January 2021. The Pregabalin crisis does not have the cultural weight of heroin. It does not have the political urgency of fentanyl, which arrived with body counts so large and so rapid that the response, however inadequate, was at least proportionate in its alarm. Pregabalin kills more quietly, more slowly, and in company, almost always in combination with something else, which means the death is attributed to the combination rather than to any single cause, which means the headline never reads Pregabalin kills. The headline reads drug-related death. The detail about Pregabalin appears in the 5th paragraph, if it appears at all. This is how a silent epidemic sustains itself. Not through concealment. The data is public, the papers are published, the coroner reports are accessible to anyone who searches for them. Through legibility. The crisis is too diffuse, too chemically technical, too entangled with legitimate medicine to produce the single image that drives public understanding of a drug problem. There is no Pregabalin equivalent of the images that define the opioid crisis. No small-town photograph, no singular face. There are case files, there are spreadsheets, there are forum threads from 2005 that are still active in 2024, still accumulating replies from people describing the same symptoms in the same language, still not being read by anyone with the authority to act on them. Sarah Connolly is still teaching. She transferred to a smaller school in 2021, reducing her class size and her administrative load in ways that Dr. Mehta had recommended as part of managing the post-taper period. Her fibromyalgia pain is present but not dominant, a background presence she's learned to distinguish from the withdrawal symptoms she spent 3 years mistaking it for. She takes no Pregabalin. She takes no medication in the class of drugs that alter nervous system baseline activity. She reads the labels on everything before she takes it. She's described her experience to 2 journalists, one of whom published her account in a Sunday supplement in 2021. She reviewed the piece before publication and asked for one change. She asked that her GP not be identified. She said this not because she had forgiven the misdiagnosis of her withdrawal as fibromyalgia flare. She has said clearly that she is not, but because she understood that her GP had prescribed Pregabalin in good faith, using information that the information-producing system had not made accurate. She did not want the story to be about one GP in Leeds. She wanted it to be about the system that had given that GP incomplete tools and then moved on. The Sunday supplement published the piece. It received considerable online engagement for approximately 4 days. Then something else happened in the news cycle, and the engagement stopped. The piece is still online. It has not been updated. Richard Silverman, the chemist at Northwestern who synthesized CI 1008 in 1990, has spoken about Pregabalin's story in the years since the crisis became public. He continues to do research. He has not expressed regret about the synthesis itself. The compound he created was designed to reduce suffering, and it does reduce suffering in the right patients, with the right monitoring, with the right information. What he has said, in the careful language of a scientist who understands what his words will be used to mean, is that the distance between a molecule leaving a laboratory and a molecule entering a community is a distance across which enormous amounts can change, and that the people responsible for managing that distance have obligations that the distance itself tends to obscure. He said this in 2019. The 2009 internal document had not yet become public when he said it. When it became public a year later, his statement read differently than it had at the time. The molecule is still travelling. In new markets, in new countries, in communities where the monitoring infrastructure is years behind the prescribing infrastructure, the same arc is beginning. The same relief, the same dependency, the same gap between what the label says and what the body learns. The UK's experience will be those countries' future, the way the UK's experience was always, in its own way, the logical extension of what the animal studies had shown in 1990, and what the first forum thread had documented in 2005. Every piece of information that would have changed the outcome was available before the outcome became unavoidable. The seizures in the rats, the 2009 internal review, the 47 replies on the fibromyalgia forum, the pharmacist's letter from Pontypridd, the harm reduction caseworkers in Dublin, Afolabi's 2010 paper, cited 11 times in 2 years, changing nothing. The information moved slowly. The prescriptions moved fast. The dependency moved faster still. And in the gap between what was known and what was acted upon, a number accumulated in the toxicology reports, a number that a pathologist in Belfast published in 2016, and that stopped her colleagues mid-sentence when they read it, because the number was larger than heroin, and heroin was the thing they had spent their careers believing was the most dangerous drug in a community. They had been looking at the wrong drug. The story of Pregabalin is not a story about a drug that was hidden or illegal or created for harm. It is a story about a drug that was legal, approved, prescribed by doctors, dispensed by pharmacists, covered by national insurance, and taken in good faith by people who were suffering. And that still, through the accumulated weight of incomplete information, commercial pressure, regulatory delay, and institutional inertia, produced a crisis that filled mortuaries and emptied lives, and left a caseworker's file marked lost to follow-up in a city that had already lost enough. The drug is still prescribed. The crisis is not historical. It is present tense.